For a long time, early human civilizations appeared stable, shaped slowly by land, water, and climate. Nothing in their gradual growth suggests that they were close to failure. And yet, around 2200 BC, something began to change. In different places, far from one another, systems that had worked for generations started to weaken. Not suddenly, not loudly, but in ways that are still difficult to fully explain. If these societies were built to adapt over time, why did they begin to fail within the same window, without a single clear cause? Around 2200 BC, something caused civilizations to suddenly fail. But what was it? For a long time, the earliest large human settlements can appear, from a distance, as if they were stable systems. Fields were cultivated in repeating cycles, water followed familiar paths, and generations lived within patterns that did not seem to change in any visible way. In regions such as southern Mesopotamia, along the Nile, and in parts of the Indus Valley, people built their lives around rhythms that felt reliable enough to plan for seasons ahead. These patterns did not emerge quickly. They formed slowly, through repeated adjustment to soil, rainfall, river movement, and the limits of the human body. In this sense, stability was not a fixed state, but the result of constant small corrections over time. And because these corrections were gradual, they often remained invisible within a single lifetime. What appeared stable was, in reality, a balance that had to be continuously maintained. When thinking about this moment around 2200 BC, it becomes necessary to return to that earlier point, when humans first began to depend on predictable systems. The shift from mobile foraging to settled agriculture did not remove uncertainty from human life. It only changed its form. Instead of following food across landscapes, people began to depend on the consistency of specific places. This meant that any change in those places, even a subtle one, could have wider effects than before. The human body itself reflects this transition. Early agricultural populations often show signs of physical stress in skeletal remains, suggesting that settled life required a different kind of endurance, one tied to repetition rather than movement. Over time, entire communities became organized around the expectation that the environment would behave within a certain range. Crops would grow, if planted at the right time. Water would arrive if channels were maintained. Storage would carry people through less productive periods. None of these expectations were guarantees, but they became embedded into daily life. Archaeological evidence shows that early irrigation systems, for example, required ongoing maintenance and coordination. They were not self-sustaining structures. Their success depended on consistent human effort and on environmental conditions remaining within manageable limits. When those limits shifted, even slightly, the system could become more difficult to maintain. Yet from within the system, such shifts might not be immediately recognized as part of a larger change. A slightly lower yield in one year could be attributed to local conditions. A delayed flood might be seen as an exception rather than a pattern. This is where the idea of stability becomes more complex. Stability is often understood as the absence of disruption, but in early human societies, it may have been closer to a narrow range of tolerable variation. As long as changes remained within that range, the system could adjust. But if multiple small changes began to move in the same direction, the capacity to adjust could slowly diminish. This does not require a sudden event. It can emerge from the accumulation of shifts that are each, on their own, manageable. When looking back from the present, it is tempting to imagine a clear turning point, a moment when stability ended and decline began. However, the archaeological record rarely presents such a sharp boundary. Instead, it shows gradual changes in settlement patterns, in material culture, and in the use of space. Some areas become less densely occupied. Certain construction practices change. Trade connections appear to weaken or reorganize. These are not immediate signs of collapse. They are signs of adjustment under pressure. Around 2200 BC, these kinds of changes begin to appear in multiple regions. But to understand why this is unusual, it is necessary to first understand what stability actually meant in the context of early human societies. It was not a permanent condition. It was a continuous process of maintaining balance within a limited range. And if that balance depended on conditions that were more fragile than they appeared, then the idea of a stable civilization may have always contained within it the possibility of quiet, gradual failure. When traced back to the deeper origins of human adaptation, this raises a more subtle question. For most of human history, survival depended on flexibility, on the ability to move, to shift diet, to respond quickly to change. Settled life reduced that flexibility in exchange for predictability, but predictability only holds as long as the underlying conditions remain within a certain range. If those conditions begin to move beyond that range, even slowly, then the very systems designed to provide stability can become sources of vulnerability. This does not immediately lead to collapse. It begins as a narrowing of options, a reduction in the ability to respond, and from within the experience of those living through it, it may not have felt like a failure at all, but simply a gradual loss of reliability in things that once seemed dependable. This is the context in which the events around 2200 BC need to be placed, not as a sudden break, but as a moment when the limits of an already fragile balance may have started to become visible in ways that could no longer be easily adjusted. If stability in early human societies depended on a narrow balance, then it also depended on the limits of human perception. People did not experience their environment as a system measured across centuries. They experienced it through seasons, through the memory of recent years, and through the expectations passed down within a few generations. This created a quiet constraint. Even when conditions were beginning to shift, those shifts had to become noticeable within a human timescale before they could be understood as change. A series of slightly drier seasons might not immediately be interpreted as part of a longer pattern. A river that altered its course gradually might still appear familiar from year to year. In this way, the stability of early civilizations was tied not only to environmental conditions, but also to the way those conditions were perceived and interpreted by the people living within them. When looking back to the origins of human adaptation, this difference becomes more visible. For most of human history, before the widespread use of agriculture, small groups moved across landscapes that were themselves variable. This mobility allowed for a direct response to local changes. If a particular area became less productive, people could shift to another region. Knowledge was built around flexibility, not permanence. The body, the tools, and the social structures of these groups were aligned with movement. Settled life introduced a different relationship to time and space. Instead of responding to change by moving, communities began to respond by trying to stabilize their immediate surroundings. Fields were cleared, water was redirected, and storage systems were developed to carry resources across less productive periods. These strategies were effective within certain limits, but they also required a degree of confidence that the environment would continue to behave in recognizable ways. Once this expectation was established, it shaped decision-making. Investments in infrastructure, such as irrigation channels or permanent buildings, assumed that the conditions supporting them would remain usable over time. Archaeological evidence shows that many early settlements expanded gradually, suggesting that people experienced their environment as sufficiently stable to support growth. However, this expansion also meant that more people became dependent on the same underlying conditions. A larger population required more consistent yields, more reliable water, and more coordination. This increased the sensitivity of the system to variation. A small disruption that might have been manageable in a smaller community could have wider effects in a larger one. Yet from within the experience of daily life, these increasing dependencies may not have been fully visible. The routines of planting, harvesting, building, and maintaining continued in familiar ways. When changes occurred, they were often interpreted through existing frameworks. A poor harvest might be seen as an isolated event. A decline in water flow might be attributed to local factors. Without long-term records or a broader perspective, it would have been difficult to recognize whether these events were part of a larger shift. This introduces another dimension to the idea of stability. Stability is not only about the external environment, it is also about the alignment between expectations and reality. As long as the environment behaves within expected patterns, even with some variation, the system feels stable. But if the environment begins to move outside those expectations, the ability to interpret and respond becomes more uncertain. Around 2200 BC, the evidence suggests that in several regions, conditions began to change in ways that were not easily absorbed into existing patterns. In some areas, there are signs of reduced agricultural productivity. In others, settlement patterns shift, with some locations becoming less densely occupied. These changes do not appear as a single event. They unfold over time, and they vary from place to place. What makes them notable is their timing and their distribution. They suggest that something was affecting the balance between human systems and their environments in multiple regions within a relatively similar period. Returning to the deeper origins of human behavior, this situation highlights a tension between two modes of adaptation. One is based on flexibility and movement, developed over a long evolutionary history. The other is based on stability and place, developed more recently with the rise of agriculture. When conditions remain within expected limits, the second mode can support larger populations and more complex societies. But when conditions begin to shift beyond those limits, the reduced flexibility of settled systems can become a constraint. The response is not immediate. It emerges gradually as the gap between expectation and reality widens. This gap does not always produce clear signals. It can appear as a series of small inconsistencies, a growing difficulty in maintaining routines that once worked. Over time, these inconsistencies can accumulate, making it harder to sustain the balance that defines stability. From the perspective of those living through it, this may not have been recognized as a single problem with a clear cause. It may have felt like a series of unrelated challenges, each requiring its own response, but when viewed across regions and over longer periods, these patterns begin to form a more connected picture. The question then is not only what changed in the environment, but also how human systems, shaped by their own history of adaptation, were able or unable to respond to those changes. If stability depended on a balance that was both environmental and perceptual, then it also depended on how many layers of that balance were being held at the same time. Early civilizations were not supported by a single system, but by several overlapping ones. Water management, food production, storage, trade, and social coordination all had to function together. Each of these systems could tolerate a certain amount of variation on its own, but their interaction created a more complex structure. A change in one layer could begin to affect the others, even if the initial shift was small. For example, a slight reduction in water availability might first appear as a manageable decline in crop yield, but over time it could place pressure on storage, on labor organization, and on the distribution of resources within a settlement. None of these changes would necessarily be immediate or dramatic. They would emerge gradually through the way different parts of the system responded to one another. When tracing this back to earlier human lifeways, the contrast becomes clearer. In mobile groups, systems were simpler and more loosely connected. Food, water, and shelter were still essential, but they were not fixed to a single place. If one resource became unreliable, it did not automatically disrupt every other part of life. Movement allowed for a partial separation of pressures. In settled societies, this separation was reduced. Systems became more integrated, and as a result, more interdependent. This interdependence made it possible to support larger populations, but it also meant that stability required multiple conditions to remain within a certain range at the same time. Archaeological evidence from early urban centers shows signs of this increasing complexity. Irrigation networks extended over larger areas. Storage facilities became more prominent. Craft production and trade linked different regions together. These developments suggest that early civilizations were not static, but expanding systems that depended on coordination across both space and time. With expansion came a greater reliance on consistency. Fields had to produce enough food not only for immediate consumption but also for storage and exchange. Water systems had to function across larger distances. Social structures had to manage the distribution of resources among growing populations. Within such a system, small disruptions could begin to move through multiple layers. A changing climate that affected rainfall patterns might not only influence crops, but also the availability of water for daily use, the condition of soil over time, and the effort required to maintain irrigation channels. As these effects accumulated, the system could become more difficult to sustain, yet this difficulty would not necessarily appear as a single, identifiable problem. It would be distributed across different aspects of life, making it harder to recognize as a unified process. Around 2200 BC, the evidence suggests that in several regions, these kinds of pressures were becoming more pronounced. There are indications of changing settlement patterns, shifts in material culture, and alterations in how space was used. Some areas show signs of reduced occupation, while others appear to reorganize rather than disappear. These patterns do not point to a uniform outcome. Instead, they suggest that different communities responded in different ways to a set of pressures that may have had shared elements. Returning to the broader context of human adaptation, this moment can be understood as a test of how integrated systems respond to gradual change. Systems built on interdependence can be efficient when conditions are stable, but they can also be less flexible when those conditions begin to shift. The ability to adjust does not disappear, but it may require more coordination, more resources, and more time. If multiple pressures emerge within a similar period, the capacity to respond can become limited. This does not mean that collapse is immediate or inevitable. It means that the margin for adjustment becomes narrower. Over time, this narrowing can lead to changes that are visible in the archaeological record, even if the underlying causes remain difficult to isolate. When viewed from this perspective, the idea of stability becomes less about permanence and more about the ability to maintain alignment across several interconnected systems. If that alignment begins to weaken, even gradually, the effects can spread through the entire structure. And if similar conditions are affecting multiple regions, even in different ways, then the appearance of simultaneous change may reflect not a single event, but a shared vulnerability in how early civilizations were organized. At first glance, the regions where early civilizations developed appear too distant and too different to be meaningfully connected. The river systems of Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, and the plains associated with the Indus each followed their own patterns. The climates were not identical, the crops were not always the same, and the ways in which people organized their societies showed variation shaped by local conditions. There is no clear evidence of a single, continuous network linking all of these areas in a way that would allow a direct transmission of change. And yet, when looking at the period around 2200 BC, something begins to stand out. In several of these regions, there are signs of disruption or adjustment that appear within a broadly similar time frame. The similarity does not lie in identical outcomes, but in the presence of change itself. This raises a quiet question. If these regions were not tightly connected, why do they show signs of strain at roughly the same time? To approach this question, it is necessary to consider what kinds of forces could operate across large distances without requiring direct contact. One possibility lies in environmental systems that extend beyond local boundaries. Climate patterns, for example, do not remain fixed within a single valley or river basin. They are part of larger processes that can influence rainfall, temperature, and seasonal variation across wide areas. While early human communities would not have perceived these processes in a unified way, they would have experienced their local effects. A shift in rainfall patterns in one region might coincide with changes in river flow in another, even if the two regions had no direct interaction. When traced back to the origins of human life, this broader scale of environmental influence has always been present. Human groups adapted to landscapes that were themselves part of larger systems, shaped by atmospheric circulation, ocean patterns, and long-term climatic trends. For most of this history, mobility allowed people to respond to local changes without needing to understand the larger system behind them. With the development of settled agriculture, this relationship changed. Instead of moving through a variable environment, people began to anchor themselves within specific locations, making them more dependent on how those larger systems express themselves locally. Around 2200 BC, evidence from different regions suggests that local conditions were becoming less predictable in ways that may reflect broader environmental shifts. In Mesopotamia, there are indications of changing river behavior and agricultural stress. In Egypt, some records and later interpretations point to periods of lower Nile floods. In regions associated with the Indus, settlement patterns show signs of reorganization. These observations are not uniform, and they do not point to a single, clearly defined event. However, their timing invites comparison. The challenge lies in interpreting this comparison without assuming more connection than the evidence supports. It would be inaccurate to suggest that these civilizations were all responding to the same immediate cause in the same way. Their environments were different, and their social systems were structured differently. What can be considered is the possibility that they were all situated within a broader set of conditions that were shifting at the same time. These shifts may have taken different forms in different places, but they could still represent a shared background of change. Archaeological records do not provide a complete picture. They preserve traces of human activity, but they do not always capture the processes that led to those traces. As a result, the idea of simultaneous change must be approached with care. It is not about identifying a single moment when everything changed at once. It is about recognizing patterns that, when viewed together, suggest that multiple systems were being influenced by factors beyond their immediate control. Returning to the deeper human perspective, this situation reflects a limitation that has always existed. Humans experience their environment locally, even when the forces shaping that environment operate on a much larger scale. This creates a gap between cause and perception. A community might observe that conditions are becoming less reliable, but it would not necessarily have a way to connect that experience to changes occurring far beyond its horizon. In this sense, the apparent simultaneity of disruptions around 2200 BC does not require direct connection between civilizations. It may instead point to the presence of wider processes that were expressing themselves differently across regions. The question then becomes less about how these civilizations were linked to each other, and more about how they were each positioned within a shared, but largely unseen, framework of environmental and temporal change. If these regions were not directly connected, then the sense of shared timing must be approached through patterns that emerge when observations are placed side by side. Archaeology rarely offers a synchronized timeline in the way modern records do. Instead, it presents layers of evidence that must be compared carefully across different locations. Pottery styles shift, settlement sizes change, construction methods vary, and traces of agriculture appear more or less intensively. Each of these changes is rooted in a specific place, yet when they begin to cluster within a similar period, they invite a broader interpretation. Around 2200 BC, several regions show signs that existing systems were no longer functioning in the same way as before. The changes are not identical, and they do not occur at exactly the same moment, but they fall within a window that is narrow enough to be noticeable when viewed across centuries. In Mesopotamia, for example, some areas that were once densely occupied show signs of reduced activity, while others appear to reorganize. In Egypt, the transition between periods of centralized authority is associated with changes in how resources were managed. In regions linked to the Indus, there is evidence that settlement patterns begin to shift, with some urban centers losing prominence and smaller sites becoming more common. None of these patterns alone defines a single event. They are part of local histories. But when considered together, they suggest that multiple societies were adjusting to conditions that were becoming less predictable or less supportive of existing structures. To understand how this can happen without direct connection, it is helpful to consider the scale at which environmental systems operate. Climate is not experienced as a single global condition, but as a set of regional expressions of larger processes. Changes in atmospheric circulation can alter rainfall patterns over wide areas. Variations in temperature can influence evaporation, soil moisture, and river flow. These changes do not produce identical outcomes everywhere. Instead, they interact with local geography to create specific effects in each region. A decrease in rainfall in one area might lead to drought, while in another, it might reduce the intensity of seasonal floods. From the perspective of those living within these environments, the experience would be local and specific. Yet the underlying shift could be part of a broader pattern. When tracing this back to the longer history of human adaptation, this kind of variability is not unusual. Human populations have always lived within changing environments. What makes the situation around 2200 BC distinctive is the context in which these changes occurred. By this time, many communities had developed systems that depended on a degree of regularity. Irrigation, for instance, relies on predictable water flow. Agricultural cycles depend on seasonal timing. Storage systems are designed based on expectations of yield. When environmental conditions move outside the range that these systems are designed to handle, the effects can begin to accumulate. The response is not immediate or uniform. Some communities may adjust by altering cropping strategies or by reorganizing labor. Others may experience more difficulty, leading to changes in settlement patterns or social structure. These responses can take time to become visible in the archaeological record. They may appear as gradual shifts rather than abrupt changes. This makes it challenging to define a single point at which conditions changed. Instead, what emerges is a period during which multiple systems are under pressure, each responding in its own way. The idea of simultaneity, in this context, does not mean that everything happened at once. It means that within a span of time that is relatively short on a historical scale, different regions show signs of adjustment that may be linked to shared underlying conditions. Returning to the question of perception, this also means that people living in these regions would not have experienced a coordinated event. Each community would have encountered its own set of challenges, interpreted through local knowledge and traditions. There would have been no sense of a wider pattern connecting these experiences. This absence of perceived connection is part of what makes the period difficult to fully explain. The evidence suggests that something was affecting multiple regions, but the nature of that influence is not captured directly in the records that remain. What can be observed are the outcomes, changes in how people lived, how they organized their spaces, and how they interacted with their environment. These outcomes form a pattern that points toward a broader question. If different societies, each adapted to their own environment, begin to show signs of strain within a similar time frame, what does that suggest about the stability of the systems they depended on, and about the larger forces that shaped those systems beyond the boundaries of any single region? What makes this shared timing more difficult to dismiss is that early civilizations were not only separated by distance, but also by different local strengths. Some were built around river flooding, others around irrigation, others around mixed regional systems that connected urban centers with surrounding agricultural land. In theory, this diversity should have made their historical paths less synchronized. A society dependent on one kind of river behavior should not necessarily weaken at the same moment as a society organized around a different ecological structure. And yet, around 2200 BC, the archaeological record begins to show a broader unease. Not a single pattern repeated in exact form, but a series of changes that suggest more than coincidence. In some places, cities contract. In others, administrative systems appear less stable. In others still, settlement is redistributed rather than simply abandoned. This variety matters, because it suggests that what was shared was not one visible disaster, but a background condition that pressed differently on different systems. To understand that possibility, it helps to return once more to the beginning of the human story, when survival did not depend on large structures holding together across generations. For most of human existence, small groups could absorb local change by moving, by shifting diet, by reducing dependence on any single place. The biological and social inheritance of our species was shaped under those conditions. Settled life changed that arrangement. It allowed populations to grow and social systems to deepen, but it also tied human continuity to landscapes behaving in ways that were regular enough to support planning. Once settlements became larger and more specialized, they also became less able to respond to slow instability with simple movement. A city cannot relocate in the way a small mobile group can. An irrigation network cannot adapt as quickly as a foraging route. A political system that manages grain, labor, and storage cannot respond lightly to years of reduced reliability. This helps explain why similar background pressures could produce different visible outcomes. The same broad environmental shift might lead one region toward lower agricultural output, another toward population movement, and another toward political fragmentation. From the outside, these outcomes can seem unrelated, but from a systems perspective, they may reflect different expressions of the same deeper problem: the loss of reliable alignment between human expectations and environmental reality. Around 2200 BC, this alignment appears to weaken in several places at once. Not perfectly, not uniformly, and not in a way that allows a simple single-cause explanation, but enough to suggest that the stability of early civilizations may have rested on conditions more widely shared than once assumed. This is important because it changes the meaning of simultaneity. It is not necessary to imagine one dramatic event passing across the world. It is enough to consider that multiple societies, each in their own local setting, were exposed to a larger pattern of environmental variability that narrowed their margin for error. In such a situation, local resilience would still matter. Some places might adapt better than others. Some systems might bend and reorganize rather than break. But the fact that changes appear across distant regions within a similar historical window suggests that many of these societies were, in a quiet sense, leaning on the same kind of promise, that water, seasons, soil, and human coordination would remain predictable enough for settled life to continue without major redesign. Once that promise weakened, even slightly, differences between civilizations did not disappear, but their vulnerabilities began to look more alike. This may be why the period feels so unsettling in retrospect. We are not looking at one civilization failing for one local reason. We are looking at several human systems, built independently, beginning to show signs that complexity itself can become fragile when the world beneath it becomes less consistent. Archaeology does not allow us to hear how people describe this shift to themselves. It does not preserve their daily uncertainty with perfect clarity, but it does preserve the outlines of a pattern. Settlements changing shape, priorities changing direction, long-standing arrangements becoming harder to maintain. And when those outlines appear across regions that were never part of a single political world, the question becomes even more serious. Perhaps the most important link between these civilizations was not trade, language, or direct influence, but something more basic. All of them had moved far enough from the flexible origins of human life to become dependent on stability they could not fully control, and around 2200 BC that dependence may have started to show its limits. Water was not simply a resource in early civilizations, it was the condition that made settled life possible. Fields depended on it, but so did the organization of time, labor, and expectation. In river-based societies, the movement of water shaped the rhythm of an entire year. When floods arrived at roughly predictable times, they renewed soil, defined planting cycles, and created a sense that the environment could be worked with rather than constantly resisted. This did not mean that water was ever fully controlled. Even in the most developed irrigation systems, there was always an element of uncertainty, but over time, as patterns repeated with enough consistency, that uncertainty could be managed within familiar limits. Around 2200 BC, one of the quiet changes that begins to appear in several regions is a shift in how reliable water seems to have been. Not necessarily a complete absence, but a change in timing, in volume, or in distribution again. In Mesopotamia, the rivers that supported early cities were already known for their variability, yet they had been incorporated into systems that allowed for large-scale agriculture. These systems depended on maintaining channels, regulating flow, and coordinating labor across communities. If water arrived in unexpected ways, either too little or at the wrong time, the effort required to maintain these systems could increase. Over time, even small irregularities could begin to disrupt the balance between input and output. Fields might not receive water when needed, or they might receive it in ways that damaged rather than supported crops. The result would not necessarily be immediate failure, but a gradual increase in difficulty. In the Nile Valley, the situation was different in form but similar in dependence. The annual flood was central to agricultural life, and its relative regularity had supported long periods of continuity. When flood levels were within a certain range, they provided both water and fertile sediment. If the floods were lower than expected, the amount of arable land could decrease. If they were higher or less predictable, they could disrupt settlement and planning. Historical interpretations suggest that periods of lower flood levels may have coincided with broader changes in social organization. Again, the connection is not direct or simple, but it points to the sensitivity of human systems to variations in water behavior. In regions associated with the Indus, where river systems and seasonal patterns also played a central role, evidence indicates that settlements began to shift over time. Some larger urban centers appear to lose prominence, while smaller sites become more common. This pattern may reflect adjustments to changing water availability or distribution, although the exact mechanisms remain uncertain. What is consistent across these regions is not a single pattern of water loss, but a reduction in predictability. Water may still have been present, but not in the same reliable way that earlier systems had been built around. To understand why this matters, it is useful to return to the earlier stages of human adaptation. For mobile groups, water sources were important, but they were part of a landscape that could be navigated. If one source became unreliable, others might be found, even if this required movement over distance. Settled life changes this relationship. When people build fields, canals, and cities, They invest in a specific configuration of water within a specific place. This investment creates stability when conditions are favorable, but it also reduces the ability to respond quickly when those conditions change. The body itself reflects this shift. Agricultural labor is tied to timing, to repeated actions that depend on water being available at the right moment. When that timing becomes uncertain, the effort required to maintain production increases, and the margin for error becomes smaller. Around 2200 BC, if water systems in multiple regions were becoming less predictable, even slightly, then the effects would not be limited to agriculture alone. They would extend into storage, into trade, and into the organization of daily life. A delayed or reduced harvest affects not only immediate consumption, but also the reserves needed for the future. It influences how labor is allocated, how communities plan, and how they respond to scarcity. These effects do not appear all at once. They accumulate, often in ways that are difficult to separate from other changes. Archaeological evidence captures the outcomes of these processes, but not always the processes themselves. What can be observed are shifts in settlement, in material use, and in the scale of construction. These shifts suggest that the relationship between humans and water was becoming more difficult to manage within existing systems. The question, then, is not whether water disappeared, but whether it became less aligned with the expectations that early civilizations had built into their structures. If that alignment weakened across multiple regions within a similar period, it would help explain why systems that once appeared stable began to show signs of strain even without a single, clearly identifiable cause. What made water so powerful in early civilizations was not only that people needed it, but that entire societies had learned to trust its rhythm. Trust, in this sense, did not mean certainty. It meant that variation remained close enough to expectation for planning to continue. A river could rise a little higher or a little lower. Rain could arrive somewhat earlier or later. As long as these differences stayed within a tolerable range, communities could absorb them through labor, storage, and local adjustment. But once water began to move outside that familiar range, the problem was larger than thirst or a single failed harvest. It affected timing itself. Planting depended on knowing when soil would hold enough moisture. Irrigation depended on channels receiving flow at the right moment and in manageable volumes. Storage depended on the assumption that a poor year would still be followed by one good enough to restore reserves. Around 2200 BC, one of the deepest possibilities is that water did not vanish from the landscape so much as cease to behave in the way settled systems had come to rely on. This distinction matters. A complete disappearance would be easier to recognize, easier to describe, and perhaps easier to remember in later records. A loss of predictability is quieter. It can unfold through irregular seasons, uneven river flow, or repeated years that are not catastrophic on their own but collectively exhausting. In Mesopotamia, where irrigation was central to sustaining dense populations, water had to be moved, directed, and maintained through human effort. The environment was not generous in a simple way. It offered possibilities, but only through constant work. If flow patterns changed, if seasonal input became less dependable, or if soil conditions were altered over time by repeated irrigation under stress, then the burden on the system would increase. This would not always appear as immediate collapse. More often, it would appear as harder maintenance, narrower margins, and a growing dependence on coordination that had less room for failure. In Egypt, the Nile had long provided an unusually strong basis for continuity because its annual flood could support agricultural planning on a large scale. But that continuity was still dependent on the flood remaining within a productive range. Too low, and the land would not be watered broadly enough. Too irregular, and the timing of labor and storage would become more uncertain. The deeper issue is that societies built around recurring water cycles do not merely use water, they internalize its rhythm into administration, labor, and memory. Once that rhythm becomes less dependable, institutions that once seemed stable may begin to work less smoothly, even before any dramatic break is visible. In regions associated with the Indus, the evidence is more difficult to interpret in a simple linear way, but changes in settlement patterns suggest that access to water, or the distribution of dependable water, may also have become a more pressing question over time. Larger urban centers are not maintained in the same way forever if the ecological conditions beneath them are shifting. People may not disappear, but they may redistribute themselves, alter their dependence on large centers, or reorganize around different local opportunities. When viewed through the longer human story, this reveals something very old beneath something very recent. Human beings evolved in landscapes where flexibility was a form of safety. Water mattered then as much as later, but survival did not depend on fixed systems tied to one hydraulic rhythm. Groups could respond by moving, waiting, or changing patterns of use. Settled civilization replaced much of that flexibility with investment. Canals, fields, storage systems, and political authority all assumed that the future would resemble the recent past closely enough for those investments to remain worthwhile. Once water became less predictable, the problem was not only ecological, it was structural. The entire arrangement of social life had been built on repeated expectation. If the environment stopped repeating itself in the same way, then human systems would be forced to respond under increasing strain. Around 2200 BC, this may be part of what different regions were facing. Not one universal drought in a simple sense, not one dramatic year that changed everything at once, but a quieter erosion of confidence in the rhythms that had made settled life workable. That erosion would not look the same everywhere. In one place it might appear in lower yields, in another in changes to settlement, in another in the weakening of central control. But beneath those differences, the shared issue may have been the same. Water was still present, yet less trustworthy, and once a civilization is built on trust in timing, even a subtle failure of timing can begin to unsettle everything that follows. Once water becomes less predictable, the meaning of stress begins to shift. It is no longer only a question of whether a society has access to enough water in an absolute sense, but whether water continues to arrive in ways that match the structure of life built around it. Early civilizations did not merely settle near water. They organized labor, time, and expectation around recurring patterns that had to remain legible from one season to the next. This is what made water a foundation rather than just a necessity. A river that still flows but no longer at the expected moment can be as disruptive as one that weakens in volume. Rain that still falls but not in the usual sequence can unsettle planting even when total moisture across a year does not vanish entirely. The problem then is not simply shortage, it is mismatch. Around 2200 BC, this kind of mismatch may have become more common in ways that different civilizations experienced locally, yet with similar consequences for stability. In agricultural systems, timing is a form of hidden order. Seeds placed too early or too late can alter yield. Irrigation directed at the wrong moment can fail to support growth or can damage fields through uneven saturation. Storage practices depend on expectation as well, because reserves only work if periods of shortage remain temporary and if recovery follows within a manageable cycle. If several years arrive with irregular timing, even without constant disaster, reserves become harder to rebuild. Labor becomes harder to schedule. Confidence in the next season weakens. These are quiet forms of destabilization. They may not leave a dramatic trace in a single year, but over time they alter the relationship between people and the systems they depend on. In Mesopotamia, where human effort had to compensate for environmental variability through irrigation, this issue would have been especially serious. The maintenance of canals and the coordination of water movement required not only labor, but also a degree of confidence that the work would still align with useful patterns of flow. If that alignment weakened, more effort would produce less reliable return. Over time, this could push a system towards strain without any single moment of total breakdown. In Egypt, a civilization long shaped by the Nile's broad seasonal pulse would also have been sensitive not just to the amount of water, but to the rhythm of inundation. The Nile's historical importance lies partly in its ability to make time legible. It gave structure to labor, taxation, storage, and survival. If inundation became less dependable in depth or sequence, then the problem would extend far beyond the riverbank. Administrative confidence would weaken because predictability itself was one of the hidden supports of order. In regions associated with the Indus, where large urban centers depended on broader ecological consistency across riverine and seasonal systems, changes in water availability or route stability may likewise have influenced where people lived and how strongly they remained tied to major centers. The archaeological record suggests reorganization rather than one simple story of disappearance, and that distinction is important. Human populations often adapt by redistributing themselves before they vanish. They lower the scale of dependence on systems that no longer feel reliable. When viewed across the longer arc of human history, this makes deep sense. The older human strategy was flexibility. The newer civilizational strategy was stability through infrastructure. Around 2200 BC, the second strategy may have begun to reveal its cost. Infrastructure can magnify abundance when environmental rhythms remain steady enough. But when rhythms drift, infrastructure can trap a population inside a pattern that no longer fits the world outside it. This does not mean people stopped understanding water. It means the world became harder to read through the habits they had developed. And once the environment grows less readable, social strain often follows, not because humans fail to respond, but because response becomes slower, more expensive, and less certain. This helps explain why the signs of instability around this period do not look identical across regions. One society may have faced contraction, another fragmentation, another dispersal, but beneath those different outcomes may have been the same underlying difficulty. Water was no longer reliably translating the larger environment into a workable local rhythm. For civilizations built on the belief that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to support planting, storage, and rule, even a modest breakdown in that translation could become profound. Water did not have to disappear for civilization to weaken. It only had to stop keeping time in the way human systems had learned to trust. The most difficult changes for human societies are often not the ones that arrive with noise, but the ones that unfold slowly enough to be mistaken for normal variation. Early civilizations were built by people who could observe rivers, soil, seasons, and animal behavior with great care. Yet even careful observation has limits when change happens across spans longer than a single lifetime. A few drier years do not necessarily look like the beginning of a larger shift. A flood that arrives lower than expected may still be understood as an exception. A harvest that disappoints can be blamed on local conditions, labor problems, or chance. This is one of the quiet problems behind the period around 2200 BC. If environmental conditions were changing in several regions, they may not have done so in a way that was immediately visible as a single coherent threat. Instead, the world may have become gradually less familiar while still appearing, on the surface, recognizably the same. For early settled societies, this kind of slow instability was especially difficult because their systems depended on repeated confidence in the near future. Planting assumes that next season will resemble the recent pattern closely enough to justify present labor. Storage assumes that a poor year can be bridged because recovery is still likely. Administrative order assumes that land, water, and labor can be organized according to rhythms that remain legible. None of this requires a perfectly stable environment, but it does require an environment that changes slowly within known limits. Once those limits begin to shift, the first result is not collapse. The first result is uncertainty that does not yet know its own name. Looking back to the earliest human condition helps clarify why this matters. For most of human history, people lived in smaller groups that could respond to local stress with movement, variation in diet, and flexible use of space. The body and the social structure of these groups were not built around long-term investment in one exact location. Settled civilization altered that pattern. It allowed people to transform landscapes, but it also tied survival to systems whose success depended on continuity over time. A canal must remain useful. A field must remain productive. A settlement must remain connected to the resources that justify its existence. The slower a threat emerges, the harder it can be to decide when those investments no longer fit the world that surrounds them. Archaeology often preserves the result of such slow changes more clearly than the changes themselves. A settlement that shrinks over generations does not announce the reason in a single dramatic layer. A city that reorganizes its space, reduces monumental construction, or loses part of its population may be responding to pressures that were building quietly for decades. Soil can become more difficult to work. Water can become less dependable in timing. Trade can become less regular if agricultural output narrows. None of these things needs to be sudden to matter. In fact, their slowness may be what makes them so dangerous. Human communities are often better at surviving a visible emergency than at redesigning themselves around a reality that becomes less supportive in small increments. Around 2200 BC, this possibility becomes especially important because evidence from different regions suggests not a single blow, but a series of adjustments, contractions, and reorganizations. This pattern fits a world in which the environment had not simply failed, but had become harder to predict, harder to read, and harder to translate into stable institutions. Slow change also interacts with memory in a particular way. People remember what has happened before, but only within the horizon of lived or inherited experience. If conditions shift beyond what recent generations have known, then old expectations remain active even when they are becoming less reliable. Communities continue using familiar patterns because those patterns were formed under earlier conditions that seemed dependable for a long time. This creates a lag between environmental reality and social response. The world changes first. Human systems change later. In that gap, strain accumulates. Labor must increase to produce the same result. Confidence weakens without disappearing. Institutions grow more demanding at the very moment they become less effective. This does not produce immediate ruin. It produces a long narrowing of possibility. When viewed in this way, the mystery around 2200 BC becomes less about one dramatic event and more about a difficult human condition. Large societies may have been trying to preserve stability while the foundations of that stability were slowly moving beneath them. And because those movements were gradual, distributed, and uneven, they may have been hardest to detect precisely when they still could have been absorbed. By the time the strain became visible in settlement shifts, weakened central structures, or changing patterns of daily life, the deeper change may already have been underway for longer than anyone could clearly see. Slow change becomes even more powerful when it does not affect every place in exactly the same way. A sudden flood or a visible invasion creates a clear point of attention. People can identify the event, describe it, and organize their memory around it. But when environmental pressure is distributed unevenly across a landscape, the experience becomes harder to interpret. One district may still function well enough, while another begins to struggle. One harvest may be acceptable, while the next is less certain. A river may continue to flow, but not with the same pattern across all branches or all seasons. In this kind of situation, the larger shift remains hidden behind local differences. Early civilizations were especially vulnerable to this because their systems were built on coordination across many small places at once. Fields, canals, storage spaces, villages, and urban centers all had to remain connected through workable expectations. If slow changes began to affect different parts of that network unevenly, then the first signs of strain would not necessarily appear as a single shared crisis. They would appear as inconsistency. Some places would still seem normal enough to justify confidence. Others would require more labor, more repair, or more negotiation. This unevenness matters because it delays recognition. A society does not easily abandon its underlying assumptions when part of the system still appears to confirm them. Looking back to the deeper origins of human life helps explain why this is such a difficult condition. For most of human history, change was encountered at the scale of direct experience. A group moved through a landscape, noticed where food, water, or shelter were becoming less reliable, and adjusted through movement or altered use. The scale was smaller, and the feedback was more immediate. Settled civilization expanded that scale. People became dependent not only on what they could directly observe, but on the functioning of systems spread across wider territory and longer time. Grain grown elsewhere, water managed upstream, labor organized through authority, and storage preserved for later use all became part of daily survival. This made life more stable when conditions were favorable, but it also meant that small changes in one part of the system could travel quietly into other parts before anyone understood the larger pattern. Around 2200 BC, if environmental conditions were shifting across broad regions, the lived experience may not have been one of obvious collapse, but of repeated friction. More work might have been needed to maintain channels. Certain fields may have produced less reliably. Some settlements may have become harder to sustain in their previous form. Trade may have become less smooth if surpluses narrowed. None of these developments alone would force a civilization to redefine its understanding of the world, but together, over time, they could begin to erode the practical confidence that complex societies depend on. Archaeological evidence is often most consistent with this kind of process. Instead of a single layer of destruction, there are gradual changes in settlement density, shifts in the use of built space, and signs that some centers became less dominant while others persisted at smaller scale. These are not the marks of a world ending all at once. They are the marks of a world becoming harder to hold together in the same way as before. Slow change also affects institutions differently from how it affects individuals. A family can reduce consumption, delay a decision, or move if necessary. A city or a centralized authority cannot respond so lightly. Institutions are built around routines, obligations, and inherited assumptions. They often preserve continuity by repeating what has worked in the past. That habit is useful in stable conditions, but it becomes dangerous when the environment begins to change beyond the range that formed those routines. The more slowly the world shifts, the more tempting it is to answer new pressure with old methods. This creates a deeper paradox. What once produced stability can begin, under altered conditions, to prolong vulnerability. Around 2200 BC, this may be part of what different civilizations were facing. Not one clearly visible disaster, but a widening gap between inherited systems and a world that no longer fit them quite as well. Because the change was slow, uneven, and distributed, it may have felt manageable for longer than it truly was. And because it felt manageable, adaptation may have come later, at higher cost, and with less room for success. In that sense, the danger of slow change is not only that humans fail to notice it is that they continue to live inside older expectations while reality quietly moves away until what once seemed like ordinary variation becomes the accumulated pressure of a transformed world. The final difficulty with slow change is that it alters not only material conditions, but the meaning of normal life itself. A civilization does not fail the moment its environment begins to shift. It fails more quietly, through the growing effort required to preserve routines that once seemed natural. What had previously felt like ordinary maintenance begins to demand more labor. What had once been a reliable harvest becomes less certain. What had once been a manageable year becomes one that leaves behind a little less surplus, a little more strain, and a little less confidence in the season to come. Around 2200 BC, if this kind of pressure was spreading across different regions, then the people living through it may not have understood themselves to be standing inside a historical turning point. They may simply have felt that more things were becoming difficult at once. This is one reason slow environmental change can be so destabilizing. It does not announce itself clearly enough to force immediate reorganization, yet it steadily weakens the assumptions that hold large societies together. When traced back to the deepest background of human adaptation, this reveals an old tension. Human beings are capable of remarkable flexibility, but much of that flexibility was shaped in smaller, more mobile communities that could respond to local difficulty through movement, reduced dependence, and variation in subsistence. Settled civilization changed the scale of response. It concentrated people, labor, and expectation into places that could become extraordinarily productive, but only if the ecological patterns beneath them remained sufficiently readable. Once the world became harder to read, flexibility did not vanish, but it became harder to use. Movement carried greater cost. Reorganizing fields, water systems, or settlement patterns required cooperation across many lives, and often across institutions built to preserve continuity rather than to redesign it. This is where archaeology becomes especially revealing, because it often shows not the sudden disappearance of human presence, but the gradual thinning of complexity. Large centers may lose some of their density, monumental building may decline, administrative order may weaken, not necessarily because people forgot how to organize, but because the conditions that once made organization effective were no longer as stable as before. In some places, smaller sites appear more frequently as larger ones become less dominant. In others, the use of land changes in ways that suggest altered priorities. These are subtle signs, but together they point toward a world in which people were adjusting to a loss of reliability rather than reacting to one single catastrophe. Slow change also creates a problem of timing. Adapt too early, and the old system may still seem worth preserving. Adapt too late, and the costs of change may already be rising. This uncertainty can hold societies in place longer than is safe. Familiar systems often continue to function just well enough to encourage persistence, even while their underlying conditions are deteriorating. A canal still carries water, though less predictably. A field still produces, though less generously. A city still stands, though with increasing strain beneath its routines. The result is a kind of delayed recognition, where the world has already changed more than social expectations have. Around 2200 BC, that delayed recognition may help explain why different civilizations seem to show related signs of stress without a single shared event visible in all of them. The larger process may have been one of environmental drift and narrowing margins, while the human response took the form of local attempts to preserve continuity for as long as possible. This would produce exactly the kind of uneven pattern the archaeological record often shows, not synchronized destruction, but parallel difficulty. And perhaps this is what makes the period feel so unsettling, even now. It suggests that civilizations do not only depend on power, labor, and intelligence. They depend on a quiet agreement between human systems and the conditions around them. When that agreement weakens slowly, the damage may arrive before the explanation does. People continue planting, storing, building, and governing within forms inherited from a more stable world, while the world itself becomes less willing to support those forms. By the time the strain becomes visible enough for later generations to notice in ruins, abandoned spaces, or altered settlement patterns, the deeper process may already have been unfolding for decades. In that sense, the mystery of around 2200 BC is not only that change occurred in multiple places, it is that the most important changes may have been the ones too slow to be named clearly while they were still becoming real. Early agriculture created a new kind of human confidence. For the first time in our species' history, large populations could remain in one place not because the landscape was endlessly generous, but because people had learned to organize soil, water, labor, and time into a repeating system. This system was powerful, but it was never simple. It depended on a narrow sequence of conditions being met in the right order. Water had to arrive within a usable range. Soil had to remain productive enough to justify repeated planting. Labor had to be available at the correct moment. Harvests had to be sufficient not only for immediate use, but for storage, exchange, and the support of people who were no longer directly producing food. Around 2200 BC, one of the most important possibilities is that these food systems were beginning to show their limits. Not because farming suddenly stopped working everywhere, but because early agricultural systems were less flexible than they may have appeared during periods of relative stability. This matters because agriculture did not simply increase food, it changed the entire human relationship to risk. In earlier mobile lifeways, people responded to scarcity by shifting across landscapes, by varying diet, and by reducing reliance on any one exact place. Settled farming reduced some forms of uncertainty, but only by concentrating dependence into fewer variables. A community might now rely heavily on one flood cycle, one planting schedule, one set of managed fields, or one storage strategy. When those variables remained within expected limits, the result could be abundance. But when one or more of them shifted beyond those limits, options narrowed quickly. The archaeological record suggests that many early farming systems were highly productive, yet also vulnerable to environmental stress because they were built for repetition rather than wide variation. In Mesopotamia, agriculture relied heavily on irrigation and long-term management of land already under pressure from arid conditions. That meant food production was tied not only to water, but to sustained coordination. If water became less reliable, if salinity increased in some soils, or if yields declined gradually, then the burden would spread beyond the fields themselves. Lower output affects storage, trade, labor obligations, and the capacity of central systems to continue operating as before. In Egypt, agricultural production depended on the Nile flood remaining within a productive range. The system could absorb variation, but not without limit. If inundation became less favorable over repeated cycles, the food base supporting administrative and social continuity would also become less secure. In regions associated with the Indus, early food systems seem to have supported large urban populations for long periods, yet later shifts in settlement patterns may suggest that maintaining those populations in the same way became harder over time. What is striking is that early agriculture often looked stable precisely because it produced repetition. The same fields could be worked again, the same grains planted, the same calendars followed, but repetition can hide fragility. A food system that depends on recurring conditions may perform well for generations and still be vulnerable if those conditions begin to drift. Around 2200 BC, if rainfall patterns, river behavior, or broader climatic conditions were becoming less predictable across several regions, then food systems would have felt the pressure early, even if the visible social consequences emerged later. This helps explain why the archaeological signs of change do not always begin with obvious destruction. They can begin with contraction, reorganization, or redistribution, because food stress alters a civilization from the ground upward. It changes not only whether people eat, but how many people a system can support, how far surplus can travel, and how confidently the future can be planned. Returning to the deeper origin of human life clarifies the contrast. Human beings evolved under conditions where flexibility in obtaining food was essential. Diet changed with season, place, and opportunity. Agriculture narrowed that flexibility in exchange for scale. It allowed more people to live together, but it also made human continuity more dependent on a small set of repeating ecological relationships. Once those relationships weakened, adaptation became harder, because the food system itself was tied to fixed land, fixed timing, and fixed expectations. This does not mean early farmers were passive or incapable. They adjusted in many ways. They changed crops, redistributed labor, altered settlement patterns, and modified local strategies. But the larger point remains: early food systems were powerful because they were organized, and they were vulnerable for the same reason. The more a civilization depended on planned agricultural repetition, the more exposed it became when the world stopped repeating itself in the same way. Around 2200 BC, that may be part of what different civilizations were confronting. Their food systems had not suddenly become useless, but they may have become less forgiving, less stable, and less able to sustain the scale of life that had grown around them. As early agricultural systems expanded, they did more than produce food. They began to define how societies understood capacity, how many people a region could support, how far surplus could travel, and how stable a community could remain over time all became tied to the performance of these systems. At first, this relationship appeared to work. Settlements grew, storage increased, and labor became more organized around predictable cycles. But this growth also created a new kind of dependency. The more successful a food system became, the more people relied on it continuing to perform in the same way. Around 2200 BC, if agricultural output began to fluctuate even slightly across multiple seasons, the effect would not have been limited to hunger alone. It would have begun to reshape how entire populations fit within their environment. In earlier human lifeways, population size and movement were closely linked to immediate resource availability. Groups adjusted naturally to the limits of what a landscape could provide at a given time. Settled agriculture altered this relationship by allowing populations to grow beyond what a landscape might support under less controlled conditions. Irrigation, storage, and coordination extended the capacity of land, but they did not remove its limits. They only made those limits less visible during periods of stability. When conditions began to shift, those limits could reappear in more complex ways. A slight decline in yield might not immediately reduce population because stored resources could buffer the impact. Trade might compensate for local shortages. Labor could be intensified to maintain production. But each of these responses draws from a reserve, whether material or social. Over time, if yields do not recover to previous levels, those reserves become harder to replenish. The system continues to function, but with less margin. This is where pressure begins to accumulate in ways that are not always immediately visible. Archaeological evidence from various regions suggests that changes in settlement patterns often follow this kind of process. Instead of sudden abandonment, there may be a gradual thinning of population in certain areas. Some sites become smaller or less densely occupied. Others may be used differently, reflecting adjustments in how resources are managed. These changes suggest that food systems were no longer supporting the same scale of life in the same configuration as before. Importantly, this does not mean that agriculture stopped working. It means that it may have become less capable of sustaining previous levels of complexity without increasing strain. Returning to the biological roots of human life, This reflects a deeper tension between growth and adaptability. Human beings are capable of expanding into stable environments, but that expansion often reduces flexibility. A larger, more settled population cannot easily contract or move without significant cost. The structures that support it, fields, canals, storage facilities, and social organization, are built for continuity. When the environment begins to shift, these structures can delay immediate impact, but they also make long-term adjustment more difficult. Around 2200 BC, if food systems in different regions were becoming less reliable in subtle ways, then the first visible effects might have been changes in how populations distributed themselves across the landscape. Areas that were once intensively cultivated may have become less attractive if maintaining them required more effort for less return. Smaller or more flexible settlements may have become more viable as people adjusted to new conditions. This kind of redistribution does not appear as collapse in a simple sense. It appears as a change in scale and pattern. The larger implication is that early agricultural systems may have contained an inherent limitation. They were highly effective within a certain range of environmental stability, but less adaptable when conditions moved outside that range. Unlike mobile systems, which could respond by shifting location, agricultural systems were tied to specific land and infrastructure. Adapting them required time, coordination, and often a willingness to alter long-standing practices. These are not changes that happen quickly, especially in societies where stability had been experienced for generations. This is why the period around 2200 BC may be understood not only as a moment of environmental change, but as a moment when the limits of agricultural expansion became more visible. Food systems did not fail in a single event. They may have become less aligned with the conditions they depended on, leading to gradual adjustments that, over time, reshaped how civilizations could sustain themselves. The question is not simply whether people had enough to eat, but whether the systems that provided that food could continue to support the same scale of human life without becoming increasingly fragile. As pressure builds within a food system, the most important changes are often not visible in the fields themselves, but in how people begin to reorganize their lives around those fields. A harvest that is slightly less reliable does not immediately empty a settlement, but it begins to alter decisions that accumulate over time. How much grain is kept in storage? How much is exchanged? How much labor is invested in maintaining land that is no longer as productive? All of these become questions that shape the structure of a society. Around 2200 BC, if early agricultural systems were becoming less dependable across repeated cycles, then these decisions would have begun to shift in ways that are only indirectly visible through the archaeological record. One of the first effects of reduced reliability is a change in risk. When food production is consistent, risk can be distributed across time. A poor year can be absorbed because the expectation of recovery remains strong. But when variation becomes more frequent or less predictable, each decision carries greater uncertainty. Storing more grain may seem safer, but it reduces what can be exchanged or consumed in the present. Expanding cultivation may increase output in the short term, but it also increases dependence on land that may already be under stress. Reducing population pressure in one area may relieve strain locally, but it requires movement or reorganization that carries its own cost. None of these choices are simple, and they do not produce immediate uniform outcomes. They create a landscape of adjustment where different communities respond in different ways, depending on their position, their resources, and their ability to coordinate change. Archaeological patterns from this period often reflect this diversity of response. In some regions, large urban centers appear to lose part of their population over time, while smaller settlements become more common. This does not necessarily indicate a sudden collapse of knowledge or organization. It may indicate a shift towards systems that require less concentrated dependence on large-scale food production. Smaller communities can operate with greater flexibility, drawing on local resources and adjusting more quickly to variation. In other areas, existing centers persist but show signs of altered use, suggesting that the structure of life within them was changing, even if the physical location remained occupied. These patterns are consistent with a gradual rebalancing rather than a single decisive break. When viewed in the context of long-term human adaptation, this rebalancing reflects an older strategy re-emerging within a newer system. Human societies that had become highly structured around fixed agricultural cycles may have begun, under pressure, to move toward forms of organization that allowed more variation. This does not mean a return to earlier lifeways, but it suggests a shift in emphasis from maximizing output within a stable system to managing uncertainty within a less predictable one. Around 2200 BC, this shift may have taken place unevenly across different regions, producing the impression of simultaneous change without identical outcomes. Another important effect of strain in food systems is its influence on social relationships. Food is not only a resource, it is also a basis for exchange, obligation, and authority. When surpluses are stable, they can support administrative systems, trade networks, and specialized labor. When surplus is narrow, these structures become harder to maintain in the same form. Obligations may be renegotiated, trade may contract or shift, and authority may become less effective if it can no longer rely on predictable distribution of resources. These changes do not necessarily produce immediate conflict or collapse. They often appear as gradual weakening of coordination, where systems that once worked smoothly begin to require more effort to sustain. Over time, this can alter the scale at which societies operate, even if many of their cultural practices remain continuous. The deeper pattern that emerges is one of constraint rather than sudden loss. Early agricultural systems expanded human capacity, but they did so within environmental limits that were not always visible during periods of growth. When those limits began to assert themselves more strongly, the result was not a single moment of failure, but a process in which societies adjusted, contracted, or reorganized to fit new conditions. Around 2200 BC, this process appears across multiple regions, suggesting that the balance between human systems and the environments that supported them was becoming more difficult to maintain. The question that remains is not only what caused this shift, but how deeply those early systems depended on conditions that could change without warning, and how far human organization could adapt once those conditions moved beyond the range that had once made stability possible. Cities represent one of the most complex forms of human organization in early history. They concentrate people, labor, resources, and expectations into a single place, creating systems that can produce coordination at a scale not possible in smaller communities. But this concentration also creates a particular kind of dependency. A city does not produce all that it needs within its immediate space. It depends on surrounding regions for food, on water systems that may extend beyond its boundaries, and on networks that move materials, goods, and information across distance. When these supporting systems function reliably, a city can appear stable, even enduring. Around 2200 BC, one of the quiet questions that emerges is whether some of these urban systems were beginning to exceed what their environments could consistently support. This does not require a sudden failure. It can begin with a gradual increase in the effort needed to maintain the same level of organization. A city relies on predictable inflow. Grain must arrive in sufficient quantities, water must be available in usable form, and labor must be organized to maintain infrastructure. If agricultural systems become less reliable, even slightly, the effect is amplified in urban centers because they depend on surplus rather than direct production. A village may adjust by consuming less or by altering local practices. A city must continue to support not only basic survival, but also administration, construction, and specialized work. This makes urban systems more sensitive to fluctuations in the wider landscape. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some regions, large urban centers began to change during this period. This change does not always appear as sudden abandonment. It can appear as reduced density, altered use of space, or a decline in large-scale construction. These are signs that the scale of organization may have been shifting. When fewer resources are available, or when those resources become less predictable, maintaining the same level of urban complexity becomes more difficult. Over time, this can lead to a gradual contraction of urban life. People may not disappear, but they may redistribute themselves into smaller settlements or reorganize their relationship to the city. Looking back to earlier human conditions, this shift reflects a fundamental difference between mobile and settled life. Mobile groups do not create cities because their survival depends on flexibility. Settled societies create cities as a way to coordinate larger populations and more complex activities. But once created, cities require continuity. They depend on flows that must be sustained over time. If those flows weaken, the city cannot easily adapt by changing location or scale without significant transformation. Around 2200 BC, if environmental conditions and food systems were becoming less stable, then cities would have been among the first places where this instability became visible at a structural level, not because cities were inherently weaker, but because they were more tightly connected to the broader system. A disruption in agricultural output, a change in water reliability, or a shift in trade patterns would all be felt more strongly in a place that concentrates demand. The response to this pressure is not necessarily collapse in a dramatic sense. It can take the form of adjustment. Administrative systems may become less centralized, construction may slow or change in style. Certain areas of a city may be used differently or less intensively. Over time, these adjustments can alter the character of the city itself, making it less of a dominant center and more of one part within a changing network of settlements. This process can be difficult to recognize as it unfolds, because it does not always produce clear breaks. Instead, it produces continuity under strain. Structures remain, but their function shifts. Populations remain, but their distribution changes. Institutions continue, but with reduced effectiveness. These are subtle transformations, yet they indicate that the balance supporting urban life is becoming harder to maintain. When considered alongside changes in food systems and environmental conditions, this suggests that cities around this period may have been operating closer to their limits than before. The systems that once supported growth were still present, but they may have required more effort, more coordination, and more favorable conditions than were consistently available. This does not mean that cities were destined to fail. It means that their success depended on a set of relationships that were becoming less stable. And because cities sit at the center of those relationships, they reveal changes that might be less visible in more flexible parts of the human landscape. The question that follows is not only how cities responded, but how the people within and around them began to adjust when the structures that once organized their lives became more difficult to sustain in their existing form. As urban systems come under pressure, the first visible changes often appear not as disappearance, but as a shift in how space is used and how activity is organized. A city does not vanish overnight when its supporting systems weaken. Instead, it begins to function differently. Certain areas may become less active, construction may slow, and the density of occupation may gradually decline. These changes suggest that the balance between what the city requires and what its environment can provide is becoming harder to maintain. Around 2200 BC, archaeological evidence from several regions points toward this kind of transformation. Large centers that once supported concentrated populations and organized labor begin to show signs of reduced intensity. This does not necessarily mean that people left entirely. It may mean that fewer people could be supported in the same place, or that maintaining previous levels of coordination required more effort than was available. One of the reasons this process unfolds gradually is that cities are built on accumulated investment. Buildings, roads, irrigation systems, and administrative structures represent long-term commitments. Even when conditions begin to change, there is a strong tendency to continue using these systems because they have already been established and because alternatives are not immediately available. This creates a period in which the city continues to operate, but with increasing strain. Maintenance becomes more demanding. Resources must be allocated more carefully. The margin for error becomes smaller. Over time, this can lead to a reorganization of priorities. Activities that once defined the city may become less central, while others emerge to adapt to new conditions. Looking back to the earlier human pattern of adaptation, this represents a partial shift away from concentration and toward distribution. In smaller, more flexible communities, adjustment can occur with fewer constraints. Resources are used more directly, and decisions can be made with less dependence on large-scale coordination. As pressure builds in urban systems, people may begin to rely more on these smaller forms of organization, even if the larger city remains present. This can result in a landscape where the city is still visible, but no longer functions as the dominant center it once was. Around 2200 BC, such patterns of redistribution appear in different regions. In some cases, smaller settlements increase in number or importance, while larger ones show signs of contraction. This suggests that people were not simply abandoning civilization, but adjusting its scale and structure to better match changing conditions. The movement from concentration to distribution is not a failure of knowledge or capability. It is a response to limits that become more apparent over time. When a system can no longer sustain the same level of complexity, reducing that complexity can be a way of preserving continuity under new conditions. Another important aspect of this process is the effect on coordination. Cities rely on the ability to organize labor, manage resources, and maintain infrastructure across large groups of people. This requires stable flows of information and authority. When resources become less predictable, coordinating these elements becomes more difficult. Decisions that once could be made with confidence now involve greater uncertainty. This can lead to a gradual weakening of centralized control, not necessarily through conflict, but through the simple difficulty of maintaining alignment across a system under strain. Administrative structures may continue to exist, but their effectiveness may decline if they can no longer rely on predictable inputs. This shift does not always leave clear written records, especially in periods where documentation is limited. Instead, it appears indirectly through changes in material culture, settlement patterns, and the scale of organized activity. The city becomes less of a single, coherent system, and more of a collection of parts that no longer move in perfect coordination. From a longer human perspective, this reflects the limits of scaling complexity. Human societies can build large, interconnected systems when conditions support them, but those systems require ongoing alignment between environment, resource flow, and social organization. When that alignment weakens, the system does not instantly collapse, but it begins to lose coherence. Around 2200 BC, this loss of coherence may be one of the key features shared across different regions. Cities remain, but they function differently. Populations remain, but they are distributed in new ways. Structures remain, but their role changes. These are signs of a system adjusting under pressure, not through sudden failure, but through gradual transformation. The deeper question is how far such transformation can go before the original form of the system no longer defines the way people live, and whether this process, repeated across multiple regions, reflects a broader shift in the conditions that once made large urban civilizations possible. When a city begins to lose its ability to sustain itself, the most revealing sign is not always physical ruin, but the quiet separation between form and function. Walls may still stand, streets may still exist, public spaces may still be recognizable, yet the patterns of life that once gave those structures meaning begin to thin out. Fewer people use the same spaces with the same intensity. Fewer resources move through the same channels. Fewer decisions can be coordinated from the same center. Around 2200 BC, this may be one of the deeper transitions taking place in some early urban societies. Cities did not necessarily vanish in a single dramatic moment. Instead, some of them may have remained visible as places long after they had begun to lose the level of support that once made them powerful. This matters because urban life depends not only on buildings but on continuous renewal. Food must keep arriving. Water systems must keep functioning. Labor must keep repairing what weather, time, and use slowly wear down. Authority must keep making distribution possible. When these processes remain aligned, a city feels stable. When they begin to separate, the city can still appear intact for a time, but the strain underneath becomes harder to hide. A canal that is not fully maintained may still carry water, but less effectively. A storehouse may still exist, but hold less than before. A central authority may still claim power, but struggle to move resources across the landscape with the same reliability. None of these changes alone defines collapse. Together, they suggest that the city is no longer supported at the scale it was built for. Looking back to the oldest human pattern of life makes this contrast clearer. For most of human existence, form followed immediate function. People used what could be maintained through direct effort, and moved when it no longer fit their needs. Cities reverse that relationship. They preserve form over time and expect function to continue flowing into that form. This is one of their strengths, because it allows continuity across generations. But it is also one of their weaknesses. because once the environmental and social systems beneath them begin to shift, the city can continue to exist physically, even as its practical logic weakens. Around 2200 BC, this may help explain why the archaeological record often shows transformation more clearly than destruction. Some urban centres contract, others change in the density of occupation or in the kinds of activities taking place within them. Monumental construction may decline, not because people suddenly lost technical skill, but because the surplus, coordination, and confidence needed for such projects had become harder to gather. In some places, the surrounding settlement network begins to matter more than the city itself, suggesting that people were adjusting to a world where concentrated urban dependence no longer carried the same advantage. This shift also changes the meaning of power. In a strong urban system, the city acts as a centre that gathers, redistributes, and organises. When its supporting base narrows, power becomes harder to project outward in the same way. Local communities may continue to function, but with less reliance on centralised coordination. Over time, this can make the city less necessary, even if it remains symbolically important. The result is not empty silence all at once, but a gradual reduction in the city's ability to shape the larger human landscape around it. This is a subtle form of decline, one that fits a period where environmental and food systems were already under growing pressure. If fewer surpluses could be relied upon, if water systems required more effort for less predictable return, and if populations were beginning to redistribute themselves towards smaller scales of life, then the city would become harder to justify in its previous form. Its physical presence might continue, but its role would no longer be the same. From the wider human perspective, this reveals something important about early civilizations. Their greatest achievements were not separate from nature, but deeply dependent on repeated environmental support. Cities can look like proof of human control, yet they remain tied to rhythms of land, water, and labour that no authority fully commands. Around 2200 BC, if those rhythms were becoming less dependable across several regions, then cities would have become places where that loss of dependability was especially visible. Not because they were weak from the start, but because they concentrated so much human expectation into one form. And when expectation begins to exceed what the surrounding world can regularly sustain, the city does not need to be destroyed to begin failing. It only needs to become less able, season by season and year by year, to keep its visible form aligned with the life that once filled it. When large systems begin to weaken, people do not always leave behind dramatic evidence of departure. More often, movement happens quietly, through the slow redistribution of households, labour, and daily life across a landscape that no longer supports concentration in the same way. Around 2200 BC, one of the most important possibilities is that many people were not disappearing, but relocating, dispersing, or changing the scale at which they lived. This distinction matters because collapse can easily be imagined as emptiness, when in reality it may look more like motion. A city becomes smaller, a settlement network becomes thinner in one place and thicker in another, and communities begin to depend less on large centralized systems and more on local arrangements that can absorb uncertainty more easily. Archaeology often captures this process indirectly. A major center may show reduced occupation, while smaller settlements become more numerous or more active in surrounding regions. This does not necessarily mean that the people of the larger center vanished. It may mean that the balance of life shifted away from concentration and toward dispersion. Such movement is not random. It reflects changing relationships between people, land, water, and food. If a large urban system becomes harder to sustain because yields are less reliable, water is less predictable, or administration is less effective, then smaller and more flexible settings may begin to offer a better chance of continuity. Looking back to the longer history of our species, this response has deep roots. For most of human existence, movement was one of the main ways people managed uncertainty. Human beings evolved not in fixed cities, but in mobile communities that adjusted their position according to season, resource availability, and local conditions. Settled civilization did not erase this older logic. It only reduced the situations in which it could be used easily. Once populations became tied to fields, canals, storage systems, and built environments, movement became more costly. Yet when those systems began to lose reliability, some version of that older adaptive pattern may have reappeared. Around 2200 BC, this would not have meant a simple return to foraging life. It would have meant something more subtle, people reorganizing themselves at a scale better suited to a less predictable world. This can help explain why the archaeological record often shows reconfiguration rather than simple abandonment. Large settlements may contract while smaller ones persist. Occupation may shift toward zones with more dependable water or easier access to local resources. Networks that once fed large centers may become more localized. These changes can appear fragmented when viewed site by site, but together they suggest a common logic. When stability weakens, dispersion can become a form of resilience. Smaller communities often require less surplus to survive. They can adapt more quickly to environmental variation and may depend less on centralized systems that are themselves under strain. This does not make small-scale life easy, but it can make it more flexible. Another important point is that movement does not always leave clear written explanation. People rarely leave behind simple records saying that they moved because a system had become too difficult to sustain. What remains are altered settlement patterns, changes in material distribution, and shifts in the relative importance of places. These traces suggest that around 2200 BC, some populations may have been responding to pressure not through sudden collapse, but through gradual relocation. In one region, this may have taken the form of leaving marginal land. In another, it may have meant reducing dependence on major urban centers. In another still, it may have meant spreading population more thinly across a broader area. All of these are responses to narrowing margins. They are signs that people were still adapting, but doing so within conditions that no longer favored the same scale of concentration as before. From the perspective of early civilization, this kind of movement can be hard to see because it does not fit the image of an event. It is not a single dramatic moment. It is a sequence of decisions repeated across families and generations that slowly alters the human map. But from the deeper perspective of human history, it is a familiar kind of response. When the world becomes harder to predict, movement returns as a practical form of intelligence. Around 2200 BC, if several civilizations were beginning to fail in their previous form, one reason may be that the people within them were already adjusting in quieter ways, redistributing themselves out of systems that had become too rigid, too demanding, or too vulnerable to maintain at the same scale. In that sense, movement is not the opposite of civilization. It may be one of the oldest human ways of surviving the moment when civilization stops fitting the world as well as it once did. Movement under pressure does not always begin with a clear decision to leave. More often, it begins with a change in what staying requires. A place that once supported a household with manageable effort may slowly demand more labor, more repair, and more uncertainty than before. Water may still be available, but less predictably. Fields may still produce, but less generously. A city may still stand, but offer less security in return for the obligations it imposes. Around 2200 BC, this may have been the kind of experience shaping population movement in many regions. People may not have believed they were witnessing the failure of a civilization. They may simply have felt that daily life was becoming harder to sustain within the old arrangement. This matters because movement is rarely driven by one cause alone. It usually emerges when several pressures begin to reinforce each other. Food becomes less reliable, water becomes harder to manage, obligations remain, and the balance between effort and return starts to narrow. In a large urban or agricultural system, these pressures can accumulate quietly for years before they become visible in the archaeological record. By the time a major center appears to have contracted, many smaller choices may already have been made across the surrounding population. Some families may have moved closer to more dependable local resources. Some may have spread into smaller settlements where the demands of centralized systems were weaker. Others may have remained in place but changed their relationship to land, labor, and exchange. What archaeology later shows as reorganization may have begun as a series of practical responses to a landscape that no longer rewarded concentration in the same way. Looking back to the longer human past helps explain why this kind of response would remain available even in settled societies. Human beings evolved as a species that could read environmental change through movement. not because movement was easy, but because it allowed local adjustment without requiring the whole world to become stable again. Settled life reduced the freedom to move, yet it did not erase the deeper human logic that sometimes the only workable answer to narrowing conditions is to change position, reduce scale, or loosen dependency on a failing center. Around 2200 BC, this older logic may have resurfaced within the newer framework of civilization. That would help explain why some of the clearest signs from the period are not universal destruction layers, but changing settlement networks. A large center weakens, while nearby smaller sites remain active or even become more prominent. This pattern suggests that people were not simply overwhelmed. They were adjusting, though in ways that made the older urban order harder to preserve. Another important feature of this movement is that it changes the social meaning of distance. In a stable urban system, distance can be managed through roads, storage, authority, and regular flows of goods. When those systems weaken, distance becomes heavier. Moving grain farther may cost more than it returns. Maintaining ties to a large center may demand more labor than local survival can spare. Under those conditions, staying close to immediate resources becomes more attractive than remaining integrated into a wide system. This does not mean isolation in an absolute sense. It means a shift in priority, from supporting the scale of a civilization to preserving the continuity of daily life. The result is a gradual thinning of larger structures as people orient themselves toward what can still be trusted locally. Around 2200 BC, this may have happened in different forms across different regions. In one place, it may have looked like a movement away from marginal agricultural zones. In another, it may have meant the weakening of a city's surrounding support network. In another, it may have appeared as the spread of smaller communities that no longer fed a central place with the same intensity. These are not identical outcomes, but they share a logic. When the wider system becomes less dependable, population begins to rearrange itself toward flexibility. This is why silent migration can be so historically important. It does not create the kind of dramatic image that later storytelling prefers. It leaves no single day of collapse, no one moment when everything visibly ends. Yet it may be one of the clearest signs that a civilization is losing its fit with the environment that once sustained it. People move not because they have stopped being part of history, but because they are still trying to survive inside it. And if around 2200 BC many communities were beginning to shift in this quiet way, then the weakening of civilization may have been visible first not in what was destroyed, but in where human life slowly chose to flow next. When movement becomes widespread, even if it remains gradual and uneven, it begins to reshape not only where people live, but how societies are structured across space. A civilization that once depended on concentration begins to loosen into a pattern where no single center holds the same weight. Around 2200 BC, this kind of shift may have been taking place in different regions, not as a coordinated process, but as the combined result of many local adjustments. Each decision to relocate, to reduce dependence on a central place, or to reorganize around smaller communities adds to a larger transformation that is difficult to see while it is happening, but clearer when viewed over longer time. One of the most important consequences of this redistribution is the weakening of long-distance coordination. Large urban systems rely on flows that connect distant areas. Food must move from fields to cities, materials must travel between regions, and authority must extend across space to organize these movements. When populations begin to spread out and rely more on local resources, these flows become harder to maintain, not because people lose the ability to trade or communicate, but because the conditions that once made large-scale coordination efficient become less stable. Distance becomes more costly, and uncertainty makes long chains of exchange more fragile. As a result, networks that once linked wide areas together may contract or reorganize into smaller, more localized patterns. This does not mean that connections disappear entirely. It means that their scale and reliability change. Looking back to the earliest phases of human life, this pattern has a familiar structure. Human groups have always formed networks of exchange and interaction, but those networks have expanded and contracted depending on environmental stability and resource availability. When conditions support predictability, larger networks can form and persist. When conditions become less reliable, networks tend to become smaller, more flexible, and more closely tied to immediate needs. Around 2200 BC, if environmental variability and pressure on food systems were increasing, then a shift towards smaller, more localized networks would be a logical response. Archaeological evidence often reflects this through changes in material distribution. Objects that once traveled long distances may become less common, or their movement may follow different routes. Production may become more localized, with communities relying more on what can be made or obtained nearby. These changes do not indicate a loss of skill or knowledge. They indicate a change in how societies manage risk. Large networks can distribute resources efficiently when conditions are stable, but they can also transmit disruption when conditions become uncertain. Smaller networks, while less expansive, can offer greater resilience under variable conditions. Another consequence of redistribution is the alteration of social hierarchy. In a highly centralized system, authority is often tied to the ability to gather and redistribute resources at scale. When populations disperse and rely more on local systems, this form of authority becomes harder to maintain. Power may not disappear, but it may become more distributed, more dependent on local conditions, and less able to impose uniform organization across wide areas. This can create a landscape where different communities operate with greater independence, even if they remain culturally connected. Around 2200 BC, such changes may help explain why some of the signs of instability appear as fragmentation rather than uniform collapse. A system that once operated as a single coordinated structure may begin to function as a collection of smaller, partially connected parts. From the perspective of those living through it, this would not necessarily feel like the end of civilization. It would feel like a change in how life is organized. The large center that once structured daily existence becomes less central. The broader network that once provided stability becomes less reliable. In response, people adjust toward forms of life that can be sustained with fewer assumptions about the wider world. This adjustment can preserve continuity in culture, knowledge, and practice, even as the scale of organization changes. From a longer historical view, this suggests that what appears as collapse at one level may be adaptation at another. The visible decline of large urban centers and wide networks does not mean that human life became simpler in a negative sense. It means that the form of complexity changed. Around 2200 BC, this transformation may have been taking place across multiple regions, shaped by environmental pressures, food system limits, and the growing difficulty of maintaining large-scale coordination. The result is a quieter kind of transition, one that leaves behind fewer clear markers of a single event, but many traces of a world reorganizing itself. And within that reorganization, movement is not a sign of disappearance. It is a sign that people were still responding, still adjusting, and still finding ways to live in a landscape that no longer supported the same patterns as before. As environmental strain, food uncertainty, and population redistribution begin to overlap, social pressure changes in a very specific way. It is no longer limited to the practical problem of producing enough resources. It begins to affect how people relate to authority, obligation, and one another. Early civilizations were not held together by food and water alone. They also depended on systems of coordination that told people when to work, how to share resources, and who had the right to organize collective labor. These systems could feel stable for long periods because they were built on repeating conditions. If harvests were broadly sufficient, if water could still be managed, and if cities remained functional, then authority could continue to appear natural and effective. Around 2200 BC, if those underlying conditions were becoming less reliable, then the pressure would not remain at the level of environment alone. It would begin to move inward, into the social structure itself. One reason this matters is that social order depends on confidence as much as force. A centralized system can collect labor, direct storage, and organize distribution only if enough people believe that the system still works better than the alternatives. When the environment supports that belief, authority can seem like part of the natural order of life. But when yields narrow, when water becomes harder to predict, or when local communities begin to rely more on their own resources, the visible effectiveness of central organization may weaken. This does not mean people suddenly reject authority in a dramatic way. More often, the change is quieter. Obligations become harder to meet. Distribution becomes less smooth. local conditions begin to matter more than distant commands. Over time, this can reduce the practical reach of large political structures even if they still exist in name or symbol. Looking back to the deeper origins of human life, this tension has an older shape beneath it. Human beings evolved in groups where cooperation was essential, but where most coordination happened at a scale small enough for people to observe directly. Settled civilization enlarged that scale. It required people to trust systems of coordination extending beyond immediate personal experience. Grain might be stored in centralized facilities. Labor might be directed toward canals, walls, or buildings that served the broader system. Authority became less personal and more structural. This arrangement could be highly effective when the system produced reliable returns. But it also meant that when conditions worsened, the distance between power and daily life could become more visible. People still experienced scarcity locally, even if authority remained organized at a larger scale. Around 2200 BC, this gap may have widened in many places. Archaeological evidence from periods of transition often shows that political weakening does not always appear first as open destruction. It can appear in the reduced ability to maintain large public works, in changes to settlement hierarchy, or in the shrinking influence of central sites over surrounding regions. These are signs that authority is becoming less able to coordinate the human landscape it once shaped. In some cases, local communities may have continued much of their daily life, while central structures lost their former reach. This suggests that political weakening can be a consequence of environmental and economic strain without requiring a single dramatic overthrow. The social effect of this process is important. As central systems lose reliability, people may begin to invest more in immediate relationships, local arrangements, and smaller circles of trust. That shift does not necessarily destroy society. It changes its scale. A civilization once defined by broad coordination may begin to function through narrower forms of obligation and exchange. This can preserve life, but it can also weaken the institutions that depend on concentrated surplus and broad compliance. Around 2200 BC, this may help explain why several civilizations show signs of fragmentation or reorganization rather than uniform collapse. The pressure was real, but the response was distributed across many layers of life. Some people may have stayed in place but trusted central systems less. Others may have moved toward regions where local survival seemed more secure. Others may have continued under the old structures for as long as possible, even as those structures became less effective. From a wider historical perspective, this reveals that civilizations are not only material systems, they are agreements about coordination. They depend on the belief that large-scale organization remains worth sustaining. Once the ecological and economic foundations of that belief begin to weaken, social structure becomes harder to hold together in the same way. Around 2200 BC, the failure of civilizations may not have begun with walls falling or rulers disappearing. It may have begun with a slower change, the growing difficulty of persuading human communities to remain aligned inside systems that no longer felt as dependable as before. As central coordination weakens, the change is often felt not in sudden disorder, but in the gradual loss of alignment between different parts of society. A system that once moved in a shared rhythm begins to move unevenly. Some regions continue to function in familiar ways while others face increasing difficulty. Some groups maintain access to resources, while others must adapt more quickly to scarcity. Around 2200 BC, this unevenness may have been one of the defining experiences within early civilizations. It is not the absence of order that marks this stage, but the growing inconsistency of how order works across space and time. In a stable system, authority organizes labor, storage, and distribution in ways that feel predictable. People know when to plant, when to contribute, and what they can expect in return. When conditions begin to shift, that predictability becomes harder to maintain. Grain may not arrive in the expected quantity. Water systems may require more effort than before. Local conditions may diverge in ways that make uniform coordination less practical. Authority does not disappear immediately, but its ability to create consistent outcomes begins to weaken. This can lead to a quiet transformation in how people respond to obligation. Compliance becomes more dependent on local conditions than on central expectation. Communities that can sustain themselves locally may rely less on distant systems, while those under greater stress may find it harder to meet demands placed upon them. Over time, this uneven response reduces the coherence of the larger structure. The system still exists, but it no longer functions as a single, unified whole. Looking back to earlier human lifeways, this shift reflects a return to a more localized pattern of coordination. In small groups, cooperation is shaped by direct knowledge of conditions and immediate relationships. Settled civilizations extended cooperation across distance, requiring trust in systems that operated beyond direct observation. When those systems become less reliable, the balance shifts back toward what can be managed locally. This does not eliminate broader connections, but it reduces their dominance. Around 2200 BC, this kind of shift may have been taking place in multiple regions, contributing to the fragmentation visible in the archaeological record. Another important effect of weakening coordination is its impact on infrastructure. Large-scale systems such as irrigation networks, storage facilities, and transport routes require continuous collective effort. They are maintained not only by labor, but by the expectation that the effort will produce shared benefit. When that expectation weakens, maintaining such systems becomes more difficult. A canal that once served many communities may receive less coordinated care if those communities are no longer equally dependent on it or equally able to contribute. Over time, this can lead to a decline in the effectiveness of infrastructure, which in turn increases pressure on food production and daily life. This feedback loop can deepen the challenges already created by environmental change. Around 2200 BC, if water systems were becoming less predictable and food systems more strained, then maintaining the infrastructure that supported them would have required greater effort at a time when coordination was becoming harder to sustain. This does not create an immediate breakdown, but it can gradually reduce the capacity of the system to respond to further stress. Another layer of this process is the change in how time is experienced. In a stable civilization, time is structured through recurring cycles that align with environmental patterns. Administrative systems, labor organization, and social expectations all depend on this alignment. When environmental rhythms become less predictable, time itself becomes harder to organize. Planning becomes more uncertain. The connection between effort and outcome becomes less reliable. This can affect not only material production, but also the sense of continuity that supports social order. People may continue to follow established routines, but those routines may no longer produce the same results. Over time, this can weaken confidence in the systems that organize life, even if those systems remain formally in place. From a broader perspective, this stage of change is not defined by a single cause or a single event. It is defined by the accumulation of mismatches between expectation and reality. Environmental conditions shift, food systems narrow, populations redistribute, and coordination weakens. Each of these processes interacts with the others, creating a complex pattern that does not resolve into a simple narrative. Around 2200 BC, this complexity may be why the period resists a clear explanation. The evidence points to widespread adjustment, but not to a single, easily identified trigger. Instead, it suggests that multiple layers of early civilization were becoming harder to maintain at the same time, each contributing to a gradual transformation that changed how societies functioned, even as many elements of their culture and daily life continued. When coordination weakens across a society, the most important change may not be visible in institutions themselves, but in the way people begin to interpret the reliability of those institutions. A system can continue to exist in form, with leaders, structures, and established practices, yet its ability to guide behavior depends on whether it still produces outcomes that feel dependable. Around 2200 BC, if environmental conditions, food systems, and population patterns were all shifting in subtle but persistent ways, then the effectiveness of social organization may have begun to erode, not through a single failure, but through repeated small disappointments. A distribution that arrives late, a harvest that does not meet expectation, a canal that requires more effort than before. Each of these experiences can be absorbed on its own, but when they occur more frequently, they begin to alter how people understand the system they are part of. Trust becomes less certain, not because it is openly rejected, but because it no longer aligns as clearly with daily experience. This kind of change is difficult to measure directly in the archaeological record, yet its effects can be inferred through patterns of reorganization and fragmentation. In some regions, large political structures appear to lose their ability to maintain consistent control over surrounding areas. Smaller communities continue to function, but with greater independence. The overall structure becomes less unified, even if many of its parts remain active. This suggests that the weakening of authority may not have been driven primarily by conflict, but by a gradual loss of practical effectiveness. When systems no longer deliver predictable support, the incentive to remain fully aligned with them diminishes over time. Looking back to earlier human conditions, this reflects a return to a more immediate form of decision-making. In small-scale societies, trust is built through direct observation of results. Cooperation is sustained because its benefits are visible and shared within a limited group. Large civilizations extend this logic across distance and complexity, requiring people to trust processes they cannot fully observe. When those processes become less reliable, the balance shifts. People continue to cooperate, but more within the range of what they can see and verify. This shift does not necessarily break a society apart at once. It changes the scale at which cohesion operates. Around 2200 BC, this may help explain why evidence from different regions often shows fragmentation rather than uniform collapse. The larger structure weakens, while smaller units persist or adapt. Authority does not vanish, but it becomes less able to coordinate across wide areas. The result is a landscape where multiple forms of organization coexist, each responding to local conditions with varying degrees of success. Another important dimension of this process is how it affects continuity over time. Institutions are designed to carry practices and expectations from one generation to the next. When the conditions that support those practices become less stable, continuity becomes harder to maintain in the same form. Traditions may persist, but their application may change. Roles and responsibilities may shift in response to new pressures. Over time, this can lead to a transformation that is gradual enough to feel continuous, even as the underlying structure becomes different. This is one reason why periods of change like that around 2200 BC can be difficult to define clearly. They do not always present a clear boundary between before and after. Instead, they show a slow transition in which many elements of the past remain visible, even as their function evolves. From a broader perspective, this stage of transformation reveals that civilizations depend not only on resources and infrastructure, but on the alignment between expectation and experience. When that alignment weakens, social systems can continue to operate for some time, but with increasing difficulty. The visible signs of this difficulty may appear in reduced coordination, altered settlement patterns, and shifts in the scale of organization. Around 2200 BC, these signs appear across different regions in ways that suggest a shared challenge, even if the specific circumstances varied. The deeper question that emerges is how long a complex society can continue to function when the conditions that once made its coordination effective begin to move beyond the range it was built to manage. If the answer unfolds slowly, through small changes that accumulate over generations, then the failure of civilizations may not be marked by a single moment, but by the gradual fading of the connections that once held them together. By the time environmental change, food pressure, urban strain, population movement, and social weakening begin to appear together, the question of cause becomes more complex than it first seems. It is natural to look for a single explanation, a single event that can account for why multiple civilizations show signs of difficulty around the same period. Yet the patterns that emerge around 2200 BC do not point clearly in that direction. Instead, they suggest a convergence, where several processes that might each be manageable on their own begin to overlap in ways that narrow the space for adaptation. This does not make the situation more dramatic in a visible sense. It makes it more difficult to resolve. Each pressure interacts with the others, amplifying effects without necessarily producing a single defining moment. Environmental conditions may become less predictable, altering water availability and agricultural cycles. Food systems may become less reliable, reducing surplus and increasing sensitivity to variation. Urban centers may begin to strain under the weight of their own dependence on consistent inflow. Populations may redistribute in response to these pressures, weakening the networks that once supported large-scale coordination. Social structures may lose some of their effectiveness as the gap between expectation and reality widens. None of these processes alone requires collapse. Together, they create a situation where maintaining stability becomes increasingly difficult. Around 2200 BC, this convergence may be one of the most important features of the period. It shifts the question away from a single cause and toward a condition of overlapping limits. When traced back to the deeper origins of human adaptation, this kind of convergence is not entirely unfamiliar. Human groups have always faced multiple pressures at once: climate, resource availability, competition, and internal dynamics have never acted in isolation. What is different in early civilizations is the scale at which these pressures operate. Larger populations, fixed infrastructure, and extended networks mean that multiple small pressures can interact across wider systems. A change in water patterns can influence food production, which affects population distribution, which alters social coordination, which feeds back into the ability to manage water and land. These interactions form a network of dependencies that is more sensitive to disruption than simpler systems. Archaeological evidence often reflects this complexity by resisting simple interpretation. In some regions, the signs of change are more visible in settlement patterns. In others, they appear in shifts in material culture or in the scale of construction. In still others, they are inferred from changes in environmental indicators. The lack of a single, uniform pattern does not mean that there is no connection. It suggests that the connection lies in the interaction of multiple factors, rather than in a single event that leaves the same trace everywhere. Around 2200 BC, this interaction may have produced a threshold condition, where the cumulative effect of several pressures made existing systems harder to sustain. Importantly, a threshold does not mean a sudden break. It can be crossed gradually, as each additional pressure reduces the margin for adjustment. A system that once had room to absorb variation may find that room shrinking over time. Adaptation becomes more difficult, not because any single change is overwhelming, but because the combination of changes limits available responses. This helps explain why the archaeological record shows both continuity and transformation. Some practices persist, some settlements remain, some forms of organization continue. At the same time, patterns shift, scale changes, and coordination weakens. These mixed signals are consistent with a world in which no single factor dominates, but where several factors together alter the conditions under which human systems operate. From a broader perspective, this challenges the idea that civilizations fail in a single moment. It suggests instead that failure can emerge from the interaction of processes that are individually subtle. Around 2200 BC, if civilizations began to fail in their previous form, it may not have been because of one cause that can be clearly identified, but because multiple layers of stability were becoming less secure at the same time. The question then becomes not which factor was most important, but how these factors combined to create a situation in which maintaining the existing structure of civilization required more than the system could consistently provide. When pressures converge, one of the most important consequences is that they begin to remove the usefulness of ordinary solutions. A food shortage can sometimes be managed through storage. A water problem can sometimes be managed through labor and repair. A weakened center can sometimes be compensated for by stronger local organization. But when several of these pressures are present at once, each response starts to depend on another part of the system that is already under strain. Around 2200 BC, this may be why the signs of change across early civilizations appear so difficult to reduce to a single explanation. It was not only that one problem appeared after another, it was that the solutions available to these societies may have been losing their effectiveness at the same time. This kind of convergence creates a deeper form of instability because it narrows the field of possible adjustment. A society can survive uncertainty if it still has room to shift resources, redirect labor, or rely on reserves built under better conditions. But when reserves are harder to rebuild, when labor must already be used to maintain failing systems, and when movement begins to thin the very networks that support large-scale coordination, then adaptation becomes more expensive and less certain. The world does not need to collapse all at once for this to matter. It only needs to become hard enough to manage that familiar strategies begin returning weaker results. Looking back to the earliest human condition helps clarify why this is so significant. For most of our species' history, adaptation depended on keeping options open. Mobility, broad diets, and flexible use of landscapes meant that no single stress had to be answered within one rigid structure. Early civilization changed that arrangement by creating systems that were highly productive but also highly committed. Fields, canals, storehouses, cities, and political authority all represented forms of investment that worked best when the surrounding world remained sufficiently stable. Once that stability weakened across several layers at once, the very complexity that had once supported civilization could begin to reduce its freedom of response. Around 2200 BC, this may have produced a condition where early societies were not simply facing hardship, but facing hardship inside systems that had become too interconnected to adjust easily. Archaeology often reflects this kind of condition through mixed signals. Some places show contraction without destruction. Some show continuity in daily life but weakening in scale. Some show persistence of settlement, yet reduced reach of centralized structures. These outcomes can seem inconsistent if one is looking for a single cause and a single pattern, but they make more sense if civilizations were not being struck by one uniform event, but were instead moving through a period in which several background supports were becoming less dependable together. A decline in reliable water does not remain a water problem for long. It becomes a food problem, then a labor problem, then an administrative problem. A reduction in surplus does not remain an economic issue alone. It affects how many people can be concentrated in one place, how much infrastructure can be maintained, and how much trust can be placed in large systems of coordination. Once these effects begin to overlap, the pressure becomes structural. The system is no longer only reacting to an external difficulty. It is beginning to strain under the way its own parts depend on one another. This is why convergence matters more than simple crisis. A crisis can be sharp but limited. Convergence changes the entire background against which decisions are made. Around 2200 BC, people may still have been planting, storing, repairing, and governing much as before, yet the world in which those actions took place may have become less supportive on several fronts at once. The result would be a growing mismatch between effort and outcome. More work might preserve less stability. More control might produce less coordination. More attachment to inherited systems might reduce the ability to redesign them in time. From a wider historical perspective, this suggests that civilizations often fail not because humans stop responding, but because response becomes trapped inside structures built for a different range of conditions. The people living through such a period are not passive. They adjust constantly. They redistribute population, narrow obligations, reorganize production, and scale down dependence where possible. But when many pressures converge, these adjustments may preserve life better than they preserve the previous form of civilization. Around 2200 BC, that may be what was happening across multiple regions. The important fact may not be that one force destroyed them, but that several forces together made the old balance progressively harder to recover, until what remained was no longer the same kind of world that had existed before. What makes convergence so difficult to recognize, both in the past and in the present, is that no single part of the system appears to explain everything. Water alone does not account for every change. Food pressure alone does not explain why urban centers weaken in some places and settlement patterns shift in others. Political weakening alone cannot explain why the same historical window shows signs of strain across regions that were not tightly connected. Around 2200 BC, the most careful answer may be that early civilizations were not undone by one force, but by the loss of alignment between many forces that had once supported one another. As long as water, harvests, labor, settlement, and authority remained broadly compatible, even an imperfect system could endure. Once those parts began to drift out of alignment together, the structure of civilization itself became harder to sustain. This helps explain why the evidence from the period often looks uneven rather than dramatic. Some regions show contraction, some show redistribution, some show weakening of large centers without total abandonment. These are not signs of one identical event repeating everywhere. They are signs of systems responding differently to a shared condition of narrowing stability. A civilization built around concentrated surplus, predictable timing, and coordinated labor does not need to be struck by a single disaster to begin failing. It only needs to become less able to keep its major parts working together across time. Looking back to the deeper origins of human life makes this clearer. Human beings evolved under conditions where survival depended on keeping options open. Movement, flexible diets, and local adaptation were older than cities, states, or irrigation. Civilization increased scale, but it also reduced freedom of response. It allowed people to build more, store more, and organize more, yet it tied that organization to stable background conditions. If those conditions shifted across several layers at once, then civilization would not necessarily end in the lives of the people experiencing it. Instead, it would begin to change form. Large centers would become harder to maintain, networks would shorten, authority would lose some reach, populations would redistribute. The world would still be inhabited, still worked, still adapted to, but no longer held together in quite the same way. Around 2200 BC, this may be the most honest way to understand what happened. Not as a single mysterious blow, and not as a neat story with one clear answer, but as a moment when multiple early civilizations encountered the limits of systems that depended on more stability than the world was continuing to provide. The question was never only whether humans could survive. Humans almost always continue by adjusting. The deeper question was whether the same scale of organized life could survive unchanged once the environment, food systems, settlement patterns, and social coordination all became slightly less dependable at the same time. If the answer was no, then what followed would not always look like destruction. It would look like transformation under pressure. And perhaps that is why this period still feels so difficult to fully explain. The real cause may not have been hidden in one lost event, but distributed across many small changes that became historically powerful only when they began to overlap. What this period reveals most clearly is not simply that early civilizations were vulnerable, but that human beings had begun to live at a scale that depended on conditions they could never fully control. For most of our history, survival came from flexibility. Small groups moved, adjusted, and responded directly to changing landscapes. But the rise of civilization changed the terms of that relationship. It allowed people to stay in one place, build beyond the horizon of a single lifetime, and create systems that joined land, water, labor, and memory into something larger than any one household could manage. This made human life more stable in some ways, but it also introduced a quieter danger. The more a society depends on continuity, the more it depends on the world continuing to behave in ways that support that continuity. Around 2200 BC, this may be what began to fail. Not humanity itself, and not even human intelligence or effort, but the assumption that large, settled systems could keep drawing order from an environment that was becoming less predictable. This matters because it shifts the meaning of collapse. Collapse is often imagined as the sudden ending of a civilization, as if history were divided neatly between success and ruin. But the evidence from this period points towards something slower and more human. People continued living. They kept planting, building, moving, storing, and adapting. What changed was the scale at which their world could be held together. The large pattern weakened before life itself did. Cities became harder to sustain. Long networks became harder to trust. Central coordination became harder to maintain. And underneath all of this was a deeper fact that reaches back to the beginning of human life. We are a species shaped by adaptation, but not always by permanence. Civilization created permanence through systems, yet those systems remain tied to water, soil, seasons, and social alignment. When those supports drifted even slightly out of balance, the weight of complexity could begin to turn against itself. This does not mean civilization was a mistake. It means that stability has always been more conditional than it appears from within it. Around 2200 BC, several civilizations may have discovered that the most dangerous changes are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes a society weakens because its environment no longer repeats itself in the same way. Sometimes it contracts because its food system becomes less forgiving. Sometimes it fragments because people are still adapting, but no longer in a form that supports the same scale of organization. From a longer view, this is not only a story about the past, it is also a lesson in how human order is built. We often notice structure when it is strong, but forget how much invisible regularity makes that strength possible. Rivers arriving on time, harvests returning often enough, local burdens remaining within tolerable limits, trust lasting longer than one season. These are quiet conditions. Yet without them, large systems begin to thin from the inside. Around 2200 BC, what failed may not have been one empire, one ruler, or one technology. What failed may have been the fit between human systems and the world those systems depended on. And if that is true, then the most unsettling part of this history is not that civilizations once weakened. It is that they may have weakened while many people were still doing everything they knew how to do, still working within inherited patterns, and still believing that what had held before might continue to hold a little longer. There is a quiet educational value in looking at this moment carefully, because it reminds us that history is not only made of dramatic events. Much of what changes human life happens before anyone can clearly name it. Around 2200 BC, the visible signs of weakening may have appeared in cities, fields, settlements, and institutions. But beneath those signs was something more fundamental. Human beings had built systems that could organize great numbers of people across time and space, yet those systems remained dependent on patterns they did not create. Rainfall, river flow, soil renewal, and seasonal timing all existed before cities, and they continued to shape what cities could become. When those patterns shifted, even slightly, the effects did not stay at the surface. They moved through every layer of organized life. This moment teaches that human systems often fail not because they are poorly designed, but because they are designed for a world that no longer behaves in the same way. Early civilizations did not lack intelligence, effort, or cooperation. They achieved remarkable coordination under the conditions available to them. But coordination depends on stability. When stability weakens across several layers at once, the same structures that once supported growth can begin to resist adaptation. What once made life more predictable can begin to make change more difficult. From a longer perspective, this reveals something about how humans understand time. We tend to think in terms of continuity, assuming that what has worked for many years will continue to work. This assumption is not irrational. It is built into the way human memory operates. People remember patterns that repeat within a lifetime or across a few generations, but the environment can change across longer spans, beyond what direct experience can easily capture. Around 2200 BC, if multiple environmental and social conditions were shifting slowly, then people may have continued to act within familiar expectations, even as those expectations were becoming less reliable. This does not mean that early societies failed to adapt. In many ways, they did adapt. They redistributed populations, altered settlement patterns, changed how resources were used, and adjusted social organization. The continuity of human life was never in question. What changed was the form of that life. Large, tightly coordinated systems became harder to maintain, while smaller, more flexible arrangements became more common. The world did not become empty. It became different in how it was organized. This distinction is important because it reframes the idea of failure. If civilizations around 2200 BC began to weaken, it was not necessarily because people stopped responding to their environment. It may have been because they were responding, but within systems that limited how far those responses could go. The effort to preserve stability can sometimes delay the recognition that stability itself is changing. By the time that recognition becomes clear, the adjustments required may be larger than the system can easily support. There is also a deeper lesson about dependence. Early civilizations demonstrate how much human life can be built on reliable patterns, but they also show how much that reliability is borrowed rather than controlled. Humans can shape land, redirect water, and organize labor, but they do so within boundaries set by larger environmental processes. When those processes shift, even in subtle ways, the effects can accumulate until the structure of life built upon them must change as well. Around 2200 BC, this accumulation may have reached a point where several civilizations could no longer sustain their previous form, not because of a single event and not because of a single failure, but because the balance between human systems and the world they depended on had become harder to maintain. The evidence suggests not a sudden ending, but a gradual transformation that reshaped how people lived across wide regions. The most useful way to understand this moment, then, is not as a mystery waiting for one final answer, but as a pattern that reveals how human systems operate. Stability is not a permanent condition. It is something that must be continuously matched to the world outside it. When that match weakens, change begins, even if it is not immediately visible. And perhaps the most important question left behind by this period is not only what caused these civilizations to weaken, but how often similar processes occur quietly beneath the surface of what appears to be a stable world. If there is a final way to understand this moment, it may be through the idea that human stability is always a relationship, never a fixed state. Around 2200 BC, that relationship appears to have shifted in subtle but far-reaching ways. The land still existed, the rivers still flowed, people still worked, built, and adapted. Yet the connection between effort and outcome may have become less certain. This is not the kind of change that announces itself clearly. It is the kind that is felt gradually, through a growing sense that what once held steady now requires more attention, more labor, and more uncertainty to maintain. What remains most important is that life did not stop. People continued to respond in the only way human beings ever have, by adjusting within the limits of their knowledge and their environment. They moved when necessary, reorganized when possible, and reduced their dependence on systems that no longer provided the same stability. In this sense, the end of one form of civilization was also the beginning of another pattern of life. The continuity of human experience remained, even as the scale and structure of that experience changed. This reveals a quiet truth about how civilizations exist. They are not separate from nature, and they are not fully in control of the conditions that sustain them. They are arrangements built within a moving world, shaped by forces that can shift without warning and without clear boundaries. When those forces remain within a familiar range, civilizations can appear solid and enduring. When they move beyond that range, even slightly, the systems built upon them must either adapt or transform. Around 2200 BC, the transformation seems to have been gradual, distributed, and uneven. No single cause explains it completely. No single event marks its beginning or its end. Instead, it appears as a convergence of small changes, each one manageable but together enough to alter the balance that early civilizations depended on. Water became less predictable, food systems less forgiving, cities more difficult to sustain, populations more mobile, and social coordination less aligned. Each of these changes alone might have been absorbed. Together, they reshaped the conditions of life. From a longer perspective, this moment invites a different way of thinking about history. It suggests that the most important shifts are not always visible as clear turning points. They may unfold slowly, across generations, in ways that are only recognized much later. It also suggests that human systems are always operating within a margin, a space where stability can be maintained as long as conditions remain close enough to expectation. When that margin narrows, change begins, even if it is not immediately understood. The educational value of this is not in finding a single answer, but in recognizing a pattern. Civilizations can be strong and fragile at the same time. They can endure for long periods while still depending on conditions that are not guaranteed to continue. They can appear stable even as the foundations of that stability begin to shift. Around 2200 BC, what may have failed was not human effort or intelligence, but the alignment between complex systems and the environment that supported them. And so the question that remains is not only what happened in that distant time, but how often similar processes occur without being noticed. If early civilizations could weaken while people continued to live, adapt, and believe in the systems around them, then how can any society know when the world it depends on is beginning to change in ways that are no longer easy to see?